we're going to be looking now at bias in particular. There are many different types of biases, as you can see here, and this does not even show all of them. But the four that you're going to be especially responsible for is measurement bias, non-response bias, response bias, and sample bias. And we're going to go over what each of those are, as long as you realize that those are not the only types of bias. So in your notes, you'll have this sheet called bias. And just to try to keep the amount of writing that you do down, what I've done is I've put the description of each in the middle. And I've written the four types of bias here: response, non-response, sampling, response, and measurement. We're going to fill in which each of those are. And then the examples, I've given 4 examples here. And I've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4. So rather than writing out the different types of biases, you can just write out the example number. So in this example, the survey question was, where do you think that we should go prom night? So first of all, non-response bias. Their descriptions are: would non-response bias be bias resulting from using a sample that does not reflect the characteristics of the population? Would it be bias occurring when particular groups are underrepresented in a survey because they choose not to participate? Would it be bias occurring from poorly measuring the outcome, leading to either an over or underestimated value? That basically means that a particular result is favored over another because of poorly measuring the outcome. This would include things like leading questions, loaded questions. Leading questions suggest a particular answer, which means that some results would be overestimated. Loaded questions usually imply some sort of negative fact that has not been previously established and would cause harsh feelings for some people, which means that some measurements could be underestimated. It could be that there's faulty tools or measurement devices, or there could be a proper analysis of the data. So if you could have an outlier and you were using the mean to estimate the average, something could be either over or underestimated because that outlier is changing the mean, and perhaps you should have used the median instead. And the fourth one is bias that occurs when participants in a survey deliberately give false or misleading answers. So which one of these do you think is non-response? So is it sample that does not reflect the population, groups are underrepresented because they choose not to participate, faulty measuring, or people giving false or misleading answers? So that one goes here. Non-response bias is bias occurring when a particular groups are underrepresented in a survey because they choose not to participate. Next one is sampling bias. Where do you think that one goes? It goes here. That is when a sample does not reflect the characteristics of the population. So if a population has different age groups, different genders, different ethnic backgrounds, different religious things like that, then so should your sample. Response bias would be this one. That's when people deliberately give false or misleading answers. It could be people lying on purpose, or like if there was a question about, do you use drugs? People might say no because they don't want to get in trouble, so they're deliberately giving false answers. And lastly, measurement bias is this one. This one's a little bit harder to explain, and it's a little bit easier to explain in examples. So for the example, remember the survey question here is, where do you think we should go prom night? So one member of the sample answers that the prom should be at his house so he didn't have to rent a limousine. That would go under response bias, because no one is really going to think that a prom is going to be at their house, and so that's response bias. He's just making a joke. Next is, our sample consists of our class, but only one male will answer the question. So a lot of people think that this is sampling bias because only one male isn't really representative of the population, but this is actually non-response bias because the sample was our class, and our class has males and females. So it does reflect the characteristics of the population, having both genders. But because only one male will answer, that doesn't mean that only one male was asked. It was only one male will answer. So that means that particular groups were underrepresented because they chose not to participate. Next example, our sample was asked, do you agree with everyone else that we should go on the Mariposa Belle, which is a tour boat in Lake Ontario for the prom? By the way, that was my prom. That was excellent. It was really cool. We went down on Lake Ontario. We went on the boat, sailed around. We ate dinner on the water. It was just awesome. Anyway, to get back on track, this represents measurement bias. So this here, do you agree with everyone else that we should go on the Mariposa Belle? That represents a leading question because it suggests a particular answer by saying, do you agree with everyone else? Some people might not want to say, no, I don't agree, because then they feel like they're being different than everybody else. So that is measurement bias. And then, of course, lastly, our sample consists of the females in our class, so that's different than this one. In this case, the sample is only the females, so the males weren't even included, so that represents a sampling bias. So sampling bias is when you have a bad sample because you didn't plan it according to what your population looks like. Non-response bias is you thought you had a good sample, but it didn't end up being a good sample because people chose not to participate. Response bias is when you didn't get good data because you got false or misleading answers. And again, measurement bias, leading questions are things where you're trying to persuade someone to answer a particular way. Loaded questions could be something like, do you think that dog walkers are irresponsible because they let their pets go without a leash? So kind of using the word irresponsible usually puts in some sort of negative connotation to it. Faulty tools or measurements, so if you're measuring somebody's weight on a scale and the scale isn't calibrated properly, it could either over or underestimate the average weight. And improper data analysis is, like I said, if you're using the mean instead of the median, but you have an outlier. So those are the different types of bias. Remember that these are not the only types of bias, but in the Unit 4 test, when we get into definitions, you'll be getting things like this, an example like one of these, and then you'll be asked what type of bias it is. And these are the only 4 that you will be responsible for knowing, as long as you realize there are other types.